Alright, so what's the deal with coral? Coral reefs are a major driver of biodiversity. They make up for less than 1% of the ocean surface, but they harbor 25% of all species. In fact, coral reefs have often been referred to by scientists as aquatic rainforests, but if you ask me, considering they have higher levels of diversity than rainforests, maybe forests should be called the coral reefs of the land. Also, coral was here first. Hi, I'm Angus, evolutionary biologist and educator, and today we are going to be doing a deep dive into coral. What it is, why it's important, and how it's being impacted by climate change. And then in later videos, we're going to be delving into how we are actually developing technologies and leveraging science in order to combat basically how we've fucked everything up. Alright, so part one. What even is coral? Is coral an animal? Is it a plant? It's giving rock. And the answer is kind of just yes, depending on your definition of coral. Coral is weird. So coral is an animal. It's a marine invertebrate whose closest relatives are sea anemones and jellyfish. It secretes aragonite, a form of calcium carbonate, in order to create a hard exoskeleton, and it clones itself to create thousands of copies in a colony that constitute what we think of as a coral reef. However, it also farms what are called zooxanthellae, which are a kind of algae, more specifically a unicellular dinoflagellate, that it keeps within its tissues in order to be able to photosynthesize. This is an example of what's called endosymbiosis, which is where one organism takes in another organism to live inside of it, so that both organisms benefit. Other examples are organelles, such as mitochondria, which live inside all of our cells to provide us with energy, or chloroplasts, which are the organelles which allow for plants to be able to photosynthesize. Both of these started out as prokaryotes, which our distant ancestors decided would be better to farm than to digest. It's a bit like how our more recent ancestors decided to farm proto-cows rather than killing them straight up, so that we could eat their babies. Same thing. Anyway, these zooxanthellae can make up as much as 30% of the biomass of coral, and provide as much as 90% of their nutritional needs. So during the day, these algae are able to photosynthesize and make food from the sun, and then at night, during the more relative safety of the darkness, the corals actually emerge from their exoskeletons and start filter feeding bits of food from the surrounding water. In turn, the corals basically fertilize their algae with their poo, providing them with all of their waste products which they need to grow. So this explains why corals are mostly found in shallow, clear water, because if the water was too dark or deep or murky, the algae wouldn't be able to get enough sunlight to photosynthesize. However, the nutrients in the water also contribute to this murkiness, which creates a paradox. Let me explain. Surprisingly, tropical waters are actually some of the most nutrient-poor areas of our ocean, but are home to the most productive ecosystems that we can find. In fact, scientists sometimes refer to these areas as blue deserts, and before coral came along, they were mostly barren. Now, evolution loves an open niche because there's no competition. And so, early coral developed this symbiotic relationship with algae in order to be able to colonize them, effectively creating oases in these deserts. So effectively, all of the fish that live in tropical areas, as well as the 500 million people that rely on these fish for food, are completely dependent on these species that are just really, really finicky about where they can live. You can see the problem. Part 2. Coral is kind of shit at evolving. So coral can reproduce both sexually and asexually. In other words, it can stay at home and make clones of itself, or it can head out into the world, meet other hot corals, and make coral babies. Cloning is a great reproductive strategy if you live in a relatively stable environment, but it becomes problematic when things change, which is kind of the hallmark of the era that we live in. See, clones are genetically identical to their parents, which means that there is no genetic diversity. This means that if a coral is not resistant to changes in temperature, or changes in pH, or whether they just look funny, all of the other clones are going to be exactly the same. In other words, it won't be able to adapt to changing environmental conditions. Sexual reproduction solves this issue by recombining genes in new ways, allowing for genetic diversity and a diversity of traits. And since some of those traits are more likely to be adaptive to a given environment, those genes will be able to be preferentially passed on. Now, coral can do this. In fact, they have mass spawning events that take place around the full moon, where they release all of their gametes, all of their egg and sperm sex cells, in some kind of mass coral orgy, and then just let nature take its course. The sperm fertilizes the egg in the water, which then develop into what are called planulae, which are the stage of the life cycle of the coral where they're somewhat mobile. And then they just kind of like float around until they find somewhere hard to attach to and then form a new colony. However, their admittedly intimidatingly impressive form of sexual reproduction is also kind of flawed because it doesn't allow for sexual selection. See, humans and other animals are able to choose their partners. Maybe they're the strongest, or the prettiest, or can dance the best, or make the nicest house or something.
They can never have too many blue trinkets and bling. Time to go out stealing again.
This feeling of attraction is the brain's way of saying, hey, this individual has great genes and you should probably make babies with them.
Genes are passed down from parents to offspring,
often determining traits like hair color, personality.
Mass spawning removes the possibility of this entirely. Problem number 2, coral can't move. It's basically a rock. The further away you are from the person that you reproduce with, genetically speaking, the fitter your offspring are going to be. This is called heterozygote fitness. Basically, you're reducing the chances that both you and your partner will share the same wonky genes. And you're also increasing the chances that new beneficial combinations of genes will arise. The reason why these genes are different in the first place is because they have evolved in different environmental conditions. As I mentioned, coral, not great at moving, basically a rock. And because of that, they are going to be somewhat similar to the individuals that they are reproducing with. They're basically like people staying in their hometown and only dating people in their hometown and only having kids that live in the same hometown. This dramatically reduces what's called gene flow, and thereby results in corals that are all rather genetically similar and therefore less robust to climate change. Problem number 3, coral grows really slowly. Some bacteria can reproduce every 20 minutes, which means that they live life on fast forward. To bacteria, climate change is happening really, really slowly. Now, coral has the opposite problem because it takes them about 5 to 10 years to reach sexual maturity. And that might not sound like a lot coming from a human perspective, but we take a really long time to be able to have children. And we have evolved mechanisms to be able to overcome those hindrances. We can wear clothes, we can migrate, we can move, we can change our environment, whereas coral simply can't do that. We're also an anomaly even for mammals. I mean, some rodents can reproduce in a matter of weeks. So to coral, climate change is even more rapid than it is to most species. Part 4. So, okay, how are they still around? So here's where things get interesting. While corals themselves take a long time to evolve, the algae that they store within them do not. And it's actually been shown that these unicellular dinoflagellates are tending towards becoming more and more temperature resistant. Additionally, while some corals are really specific about the species of algae that can live inside of them, many are not, and many actually selectively choose variations that are more adapted to the local environmental conditions. So you may know that one of the major telltale signs of coral stress is bleaching, when the reef turns white. This is a sign of stress, but maybe not for the reason that you're thinking. When the temperature starts changing too dramatically, this endosymbiotic algae starts to release toxins, which then poison the coral. In response, the coral essentially pukes them out, and since it's the algae that gives coral its color, it turns white. Since coral is more robust to environmental fluctuations than we give it credit for, it's actually still alive at this point. But now, since it's lost 90% of its food source, it's A, starving, and B, going to be more susceptible to infection and disease. Interestingly, this bleaching process is actually an evolved mechanism, because by expelling the algae, it's creating a short window in which algae which is more adapted to the current climatic conditions are able to recolonize the coral. This is also one of the avenues that we're investigating to prevent corals from going extinct, but that's for another video. Part 5. But wait, there's more. Okay, so let's say we could somehow wave a magic wand and make coral impervious to changes in temperature. We still have the issue of ocean acidification.
Oh, fish! We're all dead.
Remember when I said that corals make their skeletons out of calcium carbonate? Well, it turns out that calcium carbonate really hates acid. And it just so happens that all of the carbon dioxide that we've been pumping out into the atmosphere ever since we discovered that we could turn fossilized trees into energy is really, really good at making acid. 25% of the carbon dioxide that we release every year, about 2.8 billion tons, gets absorbed by the oceans. It then reacts with the water in the ocean to create carbonic acid. The acid then dissociates to form bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. Now, calcium carbonate requires, you guessed it, calcium and carbonate. And since carbonate binds more easily with hydrogen ions, this traps the carbonate and deprives the coral of the materials that they need to grow. This is what we call a carbon sink, a process by which carbon can become trapped in some form. And our oceans are really, really good at it. In fact, our oceans currently store somewhere along the lines of 37 trillion tons of carbon in this way. That's trillion with a T. For perspective, if we could add up all of the carbon dioxide that we've released into the atmosphere over the past 150 years, it would make up less than 1% of the carbon that's already stored there. The carbonic acid in the water usually reacts with other alkaline ions that are the result of the weathering of rocks such as basalt or limestone or olivine over geological periods of time. Now the problem is that all of these alkaline ions are being used up, and the natural processes that replenish these reserves are being outpaced by how much carbon dioxide we're adding into the atmosphere. So those acids are reacting with the only alkaline materials they can find, which, wouldn't you know it, happens to be coral exoskeletons. This causes the skeletons to become thinner, but still doesn't change the rate at which these corals want to grow upwards, which results in these brittle, thin exoskeletons that are prone to breakages from waves, fish, and British tourists. Scientists researched this using CT scanning technology, and also in the process discovered that they actually have growth rings like trees. Alright, so that was a lot. We've established that coral is some weird combination of animal and algae that's giving colorful rock, but is also really fragile. And the way that we're fucking up our environment is directly to blame for the stress that coral is under. However, I'm not a cynic, and there is reason to be optimistic. My next few videos are going to delve into what we are doing in order to rehabilitate coral and prevent it from going extinct. Things like farming algae on massive scales, to 3D printing coral reefs, to using gene editing technology to create new strains of algae, as well as what individuals like you and I can do to protect these amazing ecosystems. So if you don't want to miss those videos, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and I'll see you next time.